want to point that out to say, if we said anything in our presentation tonight that contradicts something that your local law enforcement or your local district attorney here has to say, that's not our intent. What they say applies in their judicial district. In addition to that, I think that you'll hear just a little bit of overlap with Ryan's presentation, and I think that that's a good thing, especially when it comes to some of the statistics. It doesn't hurt to hear them twice. And I think what you'll probably take away from hearing about the statistics is they're all wildly different, and it's probably largely underreported. I am a specially assigned child abuse prosecutor. I have been doing that in our 7th County Judicial District for over 7 years. So that includes child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, and human trafficking. And we will close our presentation today with one case example of a successful human trafficking prosecution from the 13th Judicial District. Randall.
My name's Randal Slayton. Like Caroline said, I'm a criminal investigator in the 13th Judicial District. I investigate crimes throughout the 7 counties that she mentioned. Primarily, I investigate child sex crimes. Caroline and I work hand in hand on many cases within the 13th District. Those including human trafficking. Mostly what I get into is child sex crimes in our district. That's where the human trafficking comes in. But I also get involved in other things when the general wants me to investigate, because he's the boss, right?
Doing the work that we do, it's often too easy for us sometimes to talk about things that are explicit in nature, and I ask that you forgive us for that. There was a young family present here and maybe some other young members, and so if we go too far, if you think we're starting to go too far, just interrupt us, but we'll try.
You're talking about them, you're good.
Okay, we'll thank you very much. So before we get into the presentation itself, just want to take the opportunity to point out to all of you that Tennessee has a mandatory child abuse reporting statute. That statute says, and I know we've got a teacher here and he's nodding his head, he's familiar with it, that's a great thing, but it actually applies to every citizen of the state. If we know or suspect child physical or child sexual abuse, then we're all mandated by statute to report that to the Department of Children's Services. And failure to do that is actually a Class A misdemeanor. And I have we'll give you the DCS hotline number before we leave here tonight. In addition to that, there's also a human trafficking hotline. Now, you're not statutorily mandated to report to it, but I think the information that we have as prosecutors, as law enforcement, as rescue operations is only as good as what people are willing to report. So I'm very excited to be part of a motivated and mobilized group here tonight, because you are the eyes and ears of your community. You've heard a little bit about things to look for in spotting possible trafficking victims. And so in Tennessee, our human trafficking hotline number is 855-558-6484. And I'll go through that again. It's 855-558-6484.
Can you say it one more time?
Yes, absolutely. We have a PowerPoint for you, but we're connected to the wrong TV. So
okay.
You can't see it over there. It's 855-558-6484.
First day is the calendar. Your calendar this way. Saves you forward backwards.
And so while we're recording numbers, I'll give you the DCS hotline as well. It's 877-237-0004. One more time, 877-237-0004. So Randall and I presented in Jamestown, and Andrew St. Clair was there, and Lydia was there. We are part of a coalition of Upper Cumberland counties that meets on at least a quarterly basis just to promote education and awareness of human trafficking. And Lydia has been very kind to travel to Cookeville for multiple of those meetings, and we're grateful for that. One of our partners, there was a question up front earlier about what happens after rescue and what sort of resources are available. There are organizations in our area that help with rehabilitation and reentry, including that for children. I know that was a particular cause of concern here up front. And we work with a partner agency called Willow Bend Farms. And so glad to share additional information about Willow Bend. A different mission in part than our, but just something that's local that we can call upon if we need a resource. And so to talk about some of the misconceptions and give you all some statistics, a very common misconception about human trafficking and the trafficking of children for commercial sex acts is that it does not happen here. It doesn't happen here in our communities. It's really not a problem in the United States, and that is false. The United States is actually ranked as one of the worst countries globally for human trafficking. And here's where I'll give you some statistics, and they're very inconsistent, I acknowledge that, but I think they're worth hearing so that you have those for your consideration. One source, which is World Population Review, says that the rate in the U.S. annually is nearly 200,000 instances. And we are not here tonight to give any sort of a political talk, and we're not going to do that, but human trafficking has become a word that's used a lot lately in the national news in the context of the border. I just want to point out to you that human trafficking and human smuggling are two separate and distinct offenses. Human smuggling involves the transportation of people from one country to another. That is a crime against a country. Human trafficking does not necessarily require the movement, the physical movement of a person, but rather the victimization can be transactional or domestic. And so human trafficking is a crime against an individual. Does that make sense?
Yes, but what bothers me about that is all these small Mexican children that have come over here without parents. Where are they?
I think
That worries me.
I think that highlights the greater concern, which is undocumented or unsupervised.
The adults
children are
I don't worry
uniquely
about.
vulnerable.
It's the children that come over here with no parents. Where are they if they're not put into that system?
Those would be uniquely
Yes.
vulnerable
Yes.
and uniquely positioned to be possible victims. I agree with you there. The FBI, our Federal Bureau of Investigation, released a publication in 2019, which is its Crime in the U.S. report. It reported 1,883 instances of human trafficking nationwide. That's a very low statistic. And so what I would suggest to you is not that the FBI is wrong, but the information they report is only as good as the information that's reported to them. And in a lot of states, a lot of areas, we have work to do to improve in recognizing the crime, investigating the crime, prosecuting the crime, and then reporting all that information to the proper agencies.
What's the statistics for children and crimes against children, trafficking, sexual abuse here in Tennessee, reported to prosecutor? I heard it's like 1 in 1,000.
So I probably don't have that number, but I'll skip ahead to some Tennessee specific statistics, and you can see the huge disparity between what we have reported here in Tennessee in 2019 and what the FBI had reported in 2019. We work in the middle part of the state with Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent Clair. He is responsible in part for amassing these statistics, and in 2019 here in Tennessee, in Coffee County, there were 100 human trafficking cases in that county alone. And so in 2019 there was at least one instance of human trafficking reported in 68 of our 92 counties across the state. Then if you look at the TBI statistics for the year 2020, that had increased to where at least one reported instance of human trafficking was reported in each county. So we had 92 out of 92 reporting at least one instance of trafficking.
For the year?
Yes, in the year 2020. So the reporting had gone up, but again, what I would like you to take away is that the numbers reported are insignificant compared to the rates at which this is actually occurring. Does that make sense as well? So within 48 hours, about 33% of runaway teenagers will become involved in the commercial sex industry. That's per our State Bureau of Investigation. Guesses, don't be afraid just to shout out a number. What number of years do you think the life expectancy for a child who's involved in human trafficking?
5.
is?
The most 5.
TBI says the average life expectancy is 7, so you're correct in that it is very low. Ryan also touched briefly on the TBI It Has to Stop campaign. It's a good online resource. The statistic that he touched on, TBI says that every 2 minutes in the U.S., a child is either bought or sold for sex. Guesses about the average age of a child in the U.S. sold for sex. 13. 13. And so TBI says just behind drug trafficking that human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal industry in our state. And so not to contradict, I think Ryan said it probably is first. I think that that's probably accurate, but again, we're just going on what's been reported, and these statistics are now almost 2 years behind. But the TBI website is our source for all of those. So some of what Ryan talked about implicates federal law. We work with state laws only, and so the offense of human trafficking in Tennessee can be found, and I'll give you the cite to the actual law. It's Tennessee Code Annotated 3913-314.
What was that? Tennessee Annotated
Right.
Code what?
Yes. 39 13 314. The Tennessee Code Annotated is available online and for free through our administrative offices of the courts, and probably other sites as well, but that's a reliable one that's free. And so there are a couple different crimes that actually fall under the umbrella of human trafficking as far as our state law is concerned, and that is involuntary labor servitude, which is forced labor services, trafficking for a commercial sex act, or promoting the prostitution of a minor. So I think that defining prostitution, everybody here probably has the ability to do that. It's sex as a business enterprise. And so if someone is engaging in that criminal activity and the victim is a minor, then that puts us in Tennessee squarely under our human trafficking statute. That means any kind of sexual activity. And so I think it's beneficial to hear from multiple perspectives. So I'm gonna let Randal talk a little bit about some of the undercover operations that he has participated in. You may have seen in the news a year ago today in Chattanooga, there was a TBI sting at I believe it was a Red Roof Inn there, and that led to the arrest of 14 adult males, all of whom were accused of seeking sex from children. And there are some really specific investigative techniques that they employ to detect this kind of activity, and I'll let Randal speak for a little bit about that work.
So just a show of hands, how many people's heard of the stings like that? It's kind of a big thing in the news when it happens, right?
It is.
And the reason it's a big thing is because usually when we do it, I know I was guilty of this, whenever we was setting this thing up and getting ready to do it, somebody brought it to the table that, hey, there may be a problem in this geographical area. with human trafficking. And I know that I was guilty of it. I was like, no, that don't happen here. Come on, that don't happen here. Well, we set up a sting, and you know, I wasn't very optimistic about it at all. But when we did it and we started getting people to come in, and they were coming in for the purpose of having sex with a child, I knew it was a real deal here. It was real. And then I started putting that together, putting two and two together, just mentally in my mind, that, hey, all these other cases that I'm working, that's not human trafficking, how close is it to human trafficking, you know? And Caroline can attest to this. There's many cases. I think I know one, a 13-year-old child. She may not even been that old. She was communicating online against her parents' wishes, and then all of a sudden she's got people circling her apartment building in the middle of the night, and they're pulling up to her, talking to her as she's walking home. You know, just strangers. And some of these people's got out-of-state tags, and they don't know who they are. And so how close is that to human trafficking? We're getting pretty close, aren't we? We're getting pretty close. But this thing that we're working on, it works. So we get a young female. In this case, it was TBI. There was TBI agents working on this, and we had a lot of people involved in this thing. So we take a hotel room, and this hotel room is where they operate from. And we've got a female that puts up, in this case, we put up back page ads. It wasn't a back page at that time. We was putting up back page ad. And the ad hadn't been up in no time, it didn't seem like. And of course, it's right there next to I-40. And we started getting hits. People were all over that. And I realized then, this is a big industry. This is money for people. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, money.
It don't matter if it's right or wrong. It don't matter who it hurts or who it don't hurt. It's about how much money that person can make, right? And that's what or satisfying their sexual, or whatever their sex needs is, right? But at the end of the day, there's a pimp, and then there's a girl. Well, we put up splashes of back page ads of this girl advertising, and they started rolling in. And like Caroline said, we ended up with 14 before the night was over. And that didn't take very long. What, I think 3 hours, maybe something like that. And it was people you wouldn't think about too. They would walk in, and many of them would just look like your normal everyday Joe. We would. I remember there were one or two that come in the lobby and was like, "No, this got to be somebody else." No, this is what we're thinking. No, that's what they were there for. And at the end of the day, I can't remember how many arrests. Well, we made 14 arrests, but I can't remember the range of charges that we had. We had one guy to even bring drugs to the table. Now, why do you think he was doing that? To lower his victim's inhibitions. All right, he's wanting to weaken her a little bit. That way she don't feel bad about it, right? Because they ain't no telling what he was going to do. What else am I missing, Caroline?
So just to put a bow on that,
Yeah.
The operation that Randall's referring to came to a close after about 2 days, and we had a host of other related charges. One individual brought alcohol, same reason. But these bait phones that TBI had set up with the phone number that rang to the investigators that was tied to the back page ad, they continued to have calls coming in for days after the investigation had wound down.
Yeah.
And so in that particular investigation, there were charged individuals that had traveled from as far away as East Tennessee. There was one foreign national among the group. And as Randall said, it was just a wide variety of age and occupation, and some would appear to be otherwise average Joes.
Yeah.
Would y'all use social media? Would y'all use social media?
We just use back page ads for this at this time, and of course back page is down. But jumped up on the spot, but that's how it happened.
Is that page like a dark web kind of thing?
Well, it's no longer there, all right? They took it down, but I think they put up others in its place.
Yes.
Yes.
How would
What?
you go about capturing the pimps? Because you can capture the Johns, you did a sting to capture Johns, what about the people that are trying to sell their, like, how would you go about trying to capture somebody who looks like normal parents, but they're trafficking their children? How would you capture them?
That is far more difficult, all right? So, let me just say, so you're taking a different approach to the investigation. Unfortunately, you gotta have victims to take that approach. Well, we can't never prosecute it. There's gotta be a crime that's happened, right? And the way we get to it is through the victim, but you gotta have a victim that's willing to talk. And by the time we get to the victims, unfortunately, very few of them cooperate.
Right?
Very few of them do. And we're trying to hone our skills and get better at working with victims. We've got the Upper Cumberland Child Advocacy Center, counseling. I know they play a big part. There's several organizations that are working, that we work with in conjunction. And we're trying to take a different approach, or trying to take a good approach to the victims, because they're already victims, and over the years in the past, people have looked at them not as victims but as criminals, and we try not to re-criminalize them or re-victimize them through the criminal process. So
I think an ultimate goal of investigations like that one is to rescue victims. But the investigation, the way TBI set this one up, just really has to go as well as it possibly could to reel in an actual victim of ongoing trafficking into that particular investigation. You really have to have a victim that's willing to be rescued and provide investigators really dangerous information to rise to the level of an investigation that might actually net a trafficker. It does happen, but
To be able to get that information to them.
and that would, I mean, I can't speak for an investigator, but that would be a dead end from an evidentiary standpoint.
So, I think you know what I'm talking about. So, where would the hope be? I mean, you're saying like the young child would have to be willing to talk with you or talk with like a forensic interview? So it's still dead in the water if there's not a forensic interview? It can't be a successful investigation?
no, even though you got a forensic interview, if that child's not willing to disclose,
Right, without a successful forensic interview that the child doesn't disclose in, you can't do anything. Is that what you're saying?
well, not necessarily. I mean, if circumstances are right, then there's some things that might be able to do. But many times, most of the time, if the child's not willing to disclose and tell their story, or at least tell us that, hey, something has happened to take us to the next level, then we really have nowhere else to go. Does that make sense? And unfortunately, that's the case.
You're not gonna talk to strangers.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
So then would you be willing to like pull in counselors to help with that? Like if the child has a known counselor that could maybe help with that?
Might
Yes.
need more information, like has the child disclosed to a counselor? You know, it's very fact dependent. It would be very fact dependent analysis.
So if the child has disclosed to a counselor, would you be able to then investigate? Or would you still need the child to disclose directly to, in a forensic interview? Because forensic interviews aren't run that way. They're not gonna pull in a counselor. Counselor's not allowed to be there. So when you have a child that's so young that they're vulnerable to manipulation and brainwashing and fear and everything else, how do you save them?
Well, we've got trained forensic interviewers, okay? And what they're trained in is not to re-victimize the child, asking questions in a particular way that don't re-victimize the child. And plus, they've got to ask those questions in a particular way that law enforcement can use it. Because if they go up and ask the child, did daddy hurt you? Whatever answer comes from that question is absolutely useless to us. Does that make sense?
Because they were saying it's a leading question.
Exactly. They're saying daddy hurt you.
Right.
So they've got to, that's why it's so hard to get information from a child, because you've got your interviewer sitting here trying not to re-victimize the child.
Right.
At the same time, I mean, it don't matter what the child tells, or the experience is going to be traumatizing to the child, either way.
Yeah.
But they've got to think about not traumatizing that child too much, and also getting information that law enforcement can use at the same time.
Well, if you have a child with a parent like that, they're likely gonna be protecting that parent because they don't understand how much danger they're actually in.
Happens a lot, yes.
So are you starting to get better about getting the interviewers trained to work with that scenario?
We got really good interviewers.
Well, and I think for purposes of our group presentation, what these questions really do highlight is that trafficking could happen with very young children. It could be in an intrafamilial setting. It could be with a third party, more of a family, friend, somebody on the periphery setting. Not only just some stranger that is using manipulation on the internet. And so there's really a wide range of ways the crime can be accomplished. You have your hand up as well.
Yes, I was just curious, going back to the ad that was run that you guys discussed, when you closed the thing down, and you still had people calling in, were you able to get them in trouble for anything?
Well, I think it's safe to say that TBI followed up on those leads.
What I was hoping, how can we stiffen the penalties for this?
So that, and we'll talk about penalties right
Okay.
before we close. I think that's an excellent
More milk
question.
stuff.
That's a legislative issue.
Yes.
That's driven by the black letter of the law. There was legislation that passed this year that did increase the penalties for the crimes that we're talking about. And that'll be the last thing we cover, if that's okay, because it's a bit
Yes.
of good news.
Yeah.
And that's brought forth by senators and whatnot, right?
Exactly. And I was going to give a case example, but do you have anything that you wanted to
No,
add
no.
before we? So one of the counties I cover is DeKalb County, and it is much like here, a largely rural county. It does have a lake, but it has communities like Liberty where neighbors are close knit enough to know and recognize, hey, that's an unfamiliar car coming down the road. That black Nissan Sentra is not a regular car here. And so I'm going to tell you about some facts that happened on August 25th of 2017 in Liberty, in DeKalb County. And the victim in that case was a 15-year-old girl at the time. And so she was uniquely vulnerable, and I'll give you some facts about her, see if you can spot some vulnerabilities. One parent was a drug addict. Both parents were in and out of jail. She did not live with both parents, and part of the time did not live with either parent. She had been in and out of the DCS system. Truancy was an issue, so she wasn't being regularly seen by her SRO or her any of her teachers. She also was juvenile delinquent for multiple things, and just generally was not well supervised. All right, and so the trafficker was not a stranger to her, but was someone she sort of knew as a third party through a boyfriend. All right, they started communicating. Guess what platform they were talking back and forth on? She and her trafficker. It's Facebook. They were messaging. She was home alone, was communicating with the now convicted defendant, and concocted a story to tell her guardian at the time that she was going to go spend the night with a friend and would be back the next day. That wasn't true. She didn't turn up the next day, but she wasn't reported missing for an additional 2 days. So she's already been out of DeKalb County for 3 days after neighbors saw that car that didn't belong. So no one was looking out for this girl very well. When she is reported missing, local law enforcement immediately gets involved, starts following leads. Her social media accounts were the first place they look. They also start looking at Backpage, and sure enough, they find images of a girl that at least very closely resembles her, who's being marketed for trafficking out of a hotel in Nashville. So it takes time, even with great facts like those, for the investigation to ramp up. By the next day, she is rescued from yet a different hotel, also in Nashville, in a room with another juvenile and a third-party adult female. In the room were cash money, client lists, multiple cell phones, drugs, indicia of drug use, and also indicia of sexual activity. And I won't go into further detail there. She and the other girl were rescued. They went into DCS custody. She had to be both physically and mentally treated. She had multiple drugs in her system, and what would the word be? Prophylactic medicine had to be administered to her for the prevention and treatment of sexually transmitted diseases. And so, who was not at the scene was the suspect. So TBI did a tremendous job linking various social media accounts and information from Backpage and interviewing of witnesses to get to the guy that had picked her up in DeKalb County and taken her to Nashville. So that defendant was charged with human trafficking. It was a B felony because her age was 15. Had she been younger than 15 when she'd been transported from DeKalb to Davidson, it would have been a Class A felony. That would be our most serious crime in Tennessee, other than a homicide. And then I mentioned the third-party adult female that was in the room with the girls. She was charged in Davidson, also with human trafficking. And then there was a third-party adult male who was attempting to flee the premises of the hotel, who was also charged with trafficking. And then my defendant, or the DeKalb County defendant, was charged in DeKalb and in Davidson. And so I'm able to share a lot of these facts tonight because 3 weeks ago he pled guilty in DeKalb County Court. So it took from 2017 until 3 weeks ago to get that case resolved. And COVID was a piece of that. We had about a year delay of everything that was trying to move through our court system due to COVID. We still have about a year backlog. He was being held in Davidson, and we were transporting back and forth, and 2 criminal prosecutions sort of moving forward on parallel tracks also slowed things down a bit. So charged with a B felony. The plea actually was to a C felony, and I'm responsible for that negotiated plea. We had no facts of him being on scene, nothing that put him at that hotel room, and so the C felony was facilitation. We certainly had those facts to show that, but for him, he was the reason she was transported from DeKalb to Davidson, and she was involved in these activities. So C felony is obviously a less serious crime, and it has a less serious penalty, but this defendant had such a long criminal history that I was able to enhance his punishment, and so we got a good sentence and a good outcome in that case. And I'm going to talk about the victim quickly in just a moment. The Davidson County case for him is still pending. So what his defense attorneys collaborated and wanted the state to do was agree that the 2 charges could be convicted if the punishment was all the same. In other words, concurrent punishment for both crimes. And I said, no, not in this instance. DeKalb wants their pound of flesh. We're going to have it. I don't care what Davidson does, but we're not having a global resolution. And so, about the victim. By the time we were gearing up to go to trial the first time, which was pre-COVID, she had turned 18, because we had a lot of time that passed. guesses about her condition at that time. She's aged out of DCS custody, so she's out in the world on her own. How do you think she was doing? She had drug issues. She lacked stability, and at that time, even with resources and offers of transportation and being connected to facilities and things, she denied wanting to leave the community and go and get help. And she was terrified to go and confront the trafficker at trial, and she was also terrified that through the court process, perhaps he or his associates might gain information about where she lived now and things like that. And there are things that we can do to provide some reassurances, but we don't work in a perfect system, right? And so in going over options with her about how cases generally get resolved once they're in the criminal justice system, she preferred that we get a plea and the certainty of a known conviction rather than the trauma of going to trial and the uncertainty of what the outcome at trial might be. And so, questions about that? Questions about that set of facts?
I just wish there was some way we could help these young ladies like her. Say, you don't have to stay here. Once you testify, we'll get you somewhere else where you can start a new
Yeah,
life.
like you hear about the witness
Protection, something like that.
So there are programs that are available. I'm not aware of anything that rises to the level of true witness protection. This particular victim was offered some different avenues.
Yes.
She's 18, she's her own individual, and at this point, she's also very sophisticated. I'm not saying that, she's got street smarts at this point. She believes that she's tough.
Right.
And she believes that she can take care of herself. And so, our job is not to railroad victims. We want to support them, and we don't always come
But
to
I'm
an
just saying
agreement
that,
about what that
do
looks
you
like.
give them an option like that?
Oh, yes.
To get them out of where
Oh,
they're
yes.
at and say, if you go ahead and testify, we'll get you out of the courthouse, get you on a bus, get you on a plane, send you somewhere where you can feel you're okay.
So, as the DA's office, we don't have support that rises to that level that
Right.
you're describing, but there are links that we can make with organizations
Oh,
that
okay.
can
That can do that.
come really close to that. But you have to have a willing participant.
Right.
And in speaking about her, and then I'll leave this piece of the presentation behind us, but she really exemplifies these characteristics that I'm sharing with you. She really exemplifies a lot of the trafficking victims that we come into contact with, because they may not believe they're a victim, and they don't want to hear that kind of language. They think that they have autonomy and that, that they're consenting to these crimes. The law doesn't permit them to do that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, because
So-
probably some of the peers they run with are telling them that. If you hadn't done this way, you deserve what you
Well,
get. That's what some people
From
tell them.
toddlers on up, they have that
Yes.
same mentality that they're
Yes.
not a victim
Yeah.
and that they consented to this. From
Yeah.
toddlers.
Oh, I can
Because that's part of
understand it,
it,
yes.
And it's hard to describe, but it's a very real phenomenon, and it really impacts the way investigators, forensic interviewers need to communicate with them in order to do that successfully.
Yes.
Would you be discouraged if you found out what the judgment was? Because he probably got time served.
He didn't. Let me think just a second. I believe his sentence was an 18-year sentence at 30%. And we can talk about release eligibility and things like that. 30% means he will come eligible for parole. And he absolutely did have some credit because he had been in well over, 4 years. And so there's no way for us to not allow that credit to happen. But we got a good sentence, and his lengthy criminal
The
history.
other one hasn't even been
Back.
tried yet.
Correct. Nashville's all still pending.
Okay.
So what they do, they do, but he's facing additional sentence on top of that out of Davidson
I
County.
may be a very mean person, but I think the sentence for somebody like that ought to be life. No parole, life. When you do that to a human being, especially a child, you don't need to be out here among us ever again.
There's not rehabilitation.
Ever again. No, there's not.
Our protection against these predators when they are turned loose.
Okay, excellent question. He is young enough that yes, he could outlive that sentence.
Yeah.
The convicted crime out of DeKalb puts him on it classifies as a violent sex offense, which puts him on our state sex offender registry for life. And that is really an additional level of supervision. And I don't want to, I may be telling you all things that you're already familiar with, so I don't want to do that, but, Tennessee Department of Probation and Parole has specially tasked probation officers who have the job of monitoring sex offenders. And there are sex offender registry rules that are restricted, where you can frequent, where you can live, who you can date, you know, whether or not children can live in the home with you, if you qualify and you're on that sex offender registry. And so those BOPP officers, their job is to keep that person under a microscope and make sure they're complying with all the restrictions, and if they're not, then that's a new crime. And so is that perfect or total protection? No, it is not, but it is a way for, that's also publicly available, so if you were concerned that a neighbor might be on the
We all know
registry,
it.
you can find that.
Yeah.
We all know
You
it.
can look up on a website,
know.
local website.
know.
Right.
See, you can look and see if there's any offenders in your area,
Yes, you
right?
can.
Yeah.
You can do it actually by physical address, yes.
We
Anything.
all know where he is.
Might be a good idea to move, and is there, I know this sounds kind of out there, but in situations like this, if you can finally get resolution that saves the child, is there a way of getting new identities for the child and family and relocating and disappearing so that that person can't then find them again?
So I don't want to put Ryan on the spot. At the DA's office, we're limited what we can do. I do think there are avenues for things that might come close to that, but it's not through the DA's office. The state of Tennessee has a program for victims of violent crimes that allows them to remain anonymous as far as their mailing address and things like that. It's called the Home Safe Program. I can share more information when we're done about that. It's online through the Secretary of State. The information is there. It might not be the same as moving to a completely different state and changing your name, but it allows you to receive mail at a location that is secure and undisclosed. And so there are some things that the state offers. What would you add, Ryan? I mean, that's a really big
Yeah,
question.
it is a big question. I would say that, as protecting your identity, if you were gonna like change your name and things like that, legally, there's nothing stopping a parent from doing that with their children and making that happen. There's nothing stopping that from happening. Facilitating that is a little more touchy subject, because like she stated earlier, it's not the witness protection program, but that doesn't mean that they can't help point you in the right direction.
I mean, I know that's kind of extreme, but when you have somebody that's a young perpetrator and could outlive their sentence, if they ever get sentenced, how do you save the person who put them there? You know, how do you protect them? And so that's, somebody, a DCS worker had told me that if in a co-parenting situation, if one of the parents is trafficking your child or abusing your child, and even if they get caught and arrested and they do jail time and they get out and the child's still a minor, and if something happens to the safe parent and they end up deceased, if they're in an accident or whatever, if something happens, then that, in the court system, that child can end up being given back to their abuser, because the court system doesn't remove the parental rights even of a convicted person. And that does not sound right to me.
No, it
So
doesn't.
I'm in the criminal arena. and that's a civil law question. On the criminal side, I can tell you that victims whose perpetrators are on the registry, one of the registry rules is that they stay away from their victim in perpetuity. And so, no, that does not rise to the level of a termination of parental rights. But on the civil side, there are statutory steps that can be taken for termination and things like that. And so
She was saying unless
Can't
somebody else
answer the
adopts,
question.
unless another parent can legally take that place, like a stepfather or a stepmother can take that place and adopt that child, then the judge wouldn't terminate the parental rights even of the person.
I don't see how DCS would ever let that happen, especially if it was made aware to them. There's zero chance DCS would let that happen. Zero chance. Like, I don't even have to think about it. I don't have to know the legalities. If DCS knows that that victim is the victim of that parent, they're not living with that parent. DCS won't let that happen.
Well, I'll tell you this, from my experience, I've testified in many DCS hearings on termination of parental rights and stuff like that, based on my investigation of that particular case. And if this child is a victim of the perpetrator and the perpetrator's parent, I promise you DCS is probably going to seek termination of parental rights. And they'll probably do that long before the criminal process is well on its feet.
Well, this is what a DCS worker said, is that unless there's another, like a step-parent that is willing to adopt that child, that the judge won't terminate, they won't force termination of rights.
Without prosecution, that's true.
Well, even with prosecution, okay, so they're wrong. That's comforting.
So I was gonna do a little bit more of an overview of the statute, but I think we'll skip that and we'll stick around and maybe these gentlemen will as well for a few minutes when we're done. I'd like to just close out with some positive news. My source on this is the Tennessean. There's an organization called Shared Hope International, and they rank states for their response to human trafficking. And in 2019, Tennessee was ranked the best state
Amen.
in its response to the threat of juvenile sex trafficking. And so that's a piece of good news. And then our most recent legislative session, aside from the special sessions, concluded in July or so of this year. And so the legislature is doing a good job in catching the trafficking statutes up with other violent sex crimes to make sure the penalties are on par, because the human trafficking statutes were so new that some of these enhancements weren't initially added. And so an example of that is trafficking for Commercial Sex Act has now been added to the list of predatory offenses that would classify someone statutorily as a child sex predator. And what that means is, should they outlive their sentence, kind of like one of the questions we've had, then that is a big enhancement should they commit a new or similar crime. So that's great news from a prosecutor's standpoint, but also as far as the standpoint of protecting the public, that enhanced penalty is really important, and it's a positive step. Law enforcement is now required to notify the Department of Children's Services in Tennessee when a person less than 18 years of age comes into custody on suspicion of prostitution. So I don't know if you processed that yet. That's a really big deal, and it should have been happening anyway. Common sense dictates if you got a juvenile, they're involved in prostitution, that's also a DCS matter. But now by law enforcement's required to report it. So I'm not suggesting that law enforcement was falling down. I'm suggesting that we weren't all doing our part to educate on the issue, and the legislature is helping us along. A statute of limitation is a period of time after which any particular crime cannot be prosecuted. And this year the legislature removed the statute of limitation for human trafficking.
Good.
Also a big deal, and I appreciate that you all see that. We've talked about young victims, we've talked about reluctance of victims, we've talked about victim characteristics that make them hesitant to want to participate in a prosecution. what this allows is, and to use R as an example, let's say they have a rescue and someone is an adult and a lot of time has passed and they now feel safe and secure to work with an investigator and work with a prosecutor. They're not time limited to do so.
Good. Very
That's a
good.
very
But
positive
doesn't-
change.
Doesn't the perpetrator need to confess or get caught red-handed in order to prosecute?
The rules of evidence and criminal procedure still apply, certainly.
So that still makes it really difficult,
It
especially
could be
because if
extremely
they're trafficking
difficult.
their own child, once the child's an adult, they're not gonna have a child then to traffic, so it's impossible to catch them once that child starts talking, that adult child starts talking.
That question's hard to answer because every case has its own set of circumstances. And every one of them's different. And it's based on circumstances. For example, if I've got somebody 5 years from now that comes in and tells me that this happened in this particular place, and there should be some biological evidence there. Well, if it's the right time, if it's the right kind of material on the floor or something, I know that there may be biological evidence. So if I can go back and get biological evidence, that makes a pretty good case if you've got somebody saying this happened, right? And we can pin that to a perpetrator, right? To a person that's committed the crime. Does that make sense? So every case has different
Even 5 years
circumstances. Even 5 years later.
But if, say,
It's
they
rare.
use like a plastic sheet over the mattress and wash the sheets, then that biological evidence isn't gonna be there.
Problem.
So the last thing I'd like to touch on, I have a lot more material, but just one other positive note. We talked about the outcome in the DeKalb County case, and it was reduced crime that had a 30% eligibility for release, which means someone could get parole after that period of time. July 1 of this year, from that point forward, anyone convicted of trafficking for commercial sex act, human trafficking, on a date after July 1 of this year, that is now a 100% sentence, which means no release, no eligibility for probation or parole. And so that's a really positive change. The legislature has been doing a lot of work to try to have the law catch up with our need as a society. So I think I would like to stop there. I think we would any of us entertain any questions from the audience. Just really excited to have this opportunity to be with everybody. I know Randal is too. We've got our contact information. You know, we don't work here in your judicial district, but our phone numbers and emails are up there. We would be happy to connect you with your resources in your judicial district if you have any difficulty doing that. We would be very happy to.
Yeah,
do that.
it's very hard for us, like, we live in Deer Lodge, which is a very small community, rural
Yes.
community. We just, from what we understand, had some trafficking busted over there. So that's scary.
Yeah.
That's a scary thought to me. You know,
I don't know if you know how small Deer Lodge is. We have a part-time post office and 2 convenience stores. Other than churches,
it.
that's all we've got. And for it to happen in a community that small, it just tells you it could happen anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say this: if you change the way you view it, if you view it from a suspect's point of view, you would be a perfect target.
Oh yeah, because we are rural, but
Right.
I'd like to think a tight-knit community. I
Yeah.
mean, if we see something going wrong, but that's another thing. Say I'm living in a community like that and I notice things, say a different car coming up down the same house, different cars. Is that something I could call the law and say, look, this is going on in my neighborhood. I don't know what's going on in that house, but all of a sudden we got a lot of cars coming up there. There seems to be a lot of young women over there. I mean,
Is that something you'd be interested
Is it
in
Eric?
as law enforcement?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, I
I'm
know
just
that.
saying, what do I look for? I've never dealt with this before until Lydia was bringing it up to us and was telling us about it. You
So,
know?
examples of reports that we've got that generated real leads were group of girls acting strange and look similar at a gas station,
Yes.
a traffic stop, a THP stop on the interstate.
Just recently.
Yes.
One recently, yeah.
And the cars circling that Randall
Right.
described, that led to a very real investigation at the home of, and that was a very young girl. I think she's 12.
She was really
Anyway,
young.
I don't want to run the risk of identifying anyone.
Right, I don't want to know that either.
Yeah.
But to me, it's very, I just wanted to know, because I
Those
know
are
our little
factors
community
law
has drug problems.
Yeah.
That we do know, we don't deny
Well,
that.
law enforcement's interested in that too.
Oh, yeah, we know that. We have a very
Yeah.
good law enforcement.
Yeah.
I mean, all we have to do is call one of the officers on their cell phone and say, look, something looks like it's strange over here. If they don't investigate it and we let our sheriff know it, there's all hell to be broke loose, because he will get on to them. He will. So, I don't worry about, but the trafficking, I just like, when I heard about that, it just broke my heart. Because my grandson comes and visits me in the summer. Of course, I don't let him run around without grandma, but I could just,
Well, it's smart of you because boys are just as much a victim.
Yeah, it is.
They're a specialty,
yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
you know, like they're
I couldn't handle it.
just
I
as much as girls.
nuts.
A lot of people think it's just mainly girls, but it's
No,
little
it's
boys,
not.
big boys, it's boys too.
Boys, period, yeah.
Yeah, baby boys, all of it.
Mhm. And it's a sad, sick world we live in, but we do live in it.
You gotta understand too, trafficking doesn't always mean that currency is what's exchanged. Right? There
No.
are other things that are exchanged, such as drugs.
Drugs, yeah.
We've had some cases in
Yeah,
Mobile.
we've had several drug houses busted in their lines.
Anything of value, for Tennessee law, that exchanges hands in conjunction with that sex act with a child.
Right.
We have trafficked.
Right. But I would love to see the sentences tougher. I would.
What's the average sentence?
So, under 15, as I mentioned earlier, would be a Class A felony, and for a convicted defendant with no prior, I've talked too much, my words are running together, no prior criminal history, excuse me, then that's a 15 to 25-year range of sentence. And then if they're over 15, the B felony, which is what the DeKalb County victim started out, that defendant was charged as B, without prior criminal history, that's an 8 to 12-year sentence at 30%.
Sorry if I put you on the spot. Do you know do you have any reciprocity information? What happens after the years? I don't know either. I'm gonna look it up now that I thought of it.
At the sex offender registry, there is reciprocity with other states. I don't think that's what you're asking me.
So like, when they recommit the same crime, right?
Recidivism.
Thank you. That word, what you said.
What did you say?
Recidivism.
Good word.
Where he does it again, or she does it again, exactly. I don't have those
Not
statistics.
reciprocity.
I don't have those statistics. I'm sure it happens.
I bet maybe the prison, because the whole goal of the prison system is to prevent recidivism. So maybe, I bet they have the statistics.
Perhaps. And so we have something that the law
Thank you, guys.
has only recently
Yes,
established.
thank you very
as a
much.
crime. Thank you very much. So I
Thank
think
you for
it's time
caring.
that information will be available to us. I think it'll require the passage.
Bye guys, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to thank both of you, because we don't have enough of you, so I want to give you a hand. Thank you very much.
Andrew and his friends here tonight, Miss Lydia. It's a great opportunity for us, but I think you should be committed, because it's a really great opportunity for your community, and we're really pleased to meet these guys from our for the first time, and so thank you as well. Yes, it is.
Don't forget the silent auction, guys. Still over there. They're having a lot of video on that.
Dave, before it goes away.
Is there a number?
what I would suggest is that let me send an email with Kelly Green that he chairs all the meetings.
Okay.
And that's how Lydia, got involved.
Oh, that's right.
Let me,
I thought, I talked to